The rain came sideways off the ridge, carrying ice in it that hadn't quite made up its mind to be sleet. Former Specialist Avery Nolan had stopped caring about the cold somewhere around hour 18. What she hadn't stopped caring about, what she would never stop caring about, was the dog going still in her arms. Scout was a Belgian Malinois, 72 pounds in his prime. Right now he weighed less, and she could count his ribs through his tactical vest. She'd been carrying him for the last 3 miles, since his right hind leg buckled on the logging road above the hollow, and there was not a world in which she was leaving him there on the wet clay. There was not a world in which she was leaving him anywhere. That was, she had come to understand the whole problem. The road below the ridge was a single lane of cracked asphalt, barely visible through the grey wall of rain. Avery moved along its edge, shoulders hunched, Scout's dead weight pressed against her chest. 11 months. 11 months of moving through the margins of the country. Cheap motels paid in cash. Church parking lots, the back of a decommissioned FEMA trailer outside Morgantown that she'd convinced a foreman to let her use for 3 weeks in exchange for pulling fence posts by hand. 11 months of feeding Scout first, eating last, stretching whatever remained of a $200 gig into dog food and black market penicillin for the wound in his flank that wouldn't fully close. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. Scout hadn't kept food down in 2. To the United States Army, Specialist Avery Nolan was a deserter. She'd walked off Bagram with a classified military working dog, absent without leave, technically in possession of government property. The paperwork said she was a criminal. The paperwork didn't know what she knew. The nightmare had started 11 months ago, inside a blown-out compound in the Deir ez-Zor province of Syria. Her unit had been tasked with a high-value location sweep. Intelligence suggested a weapons cache. It was Scout who found the room no one else would have looked in. A collapsed section of floor, a false panel, and beneath it, a waterproof courier case containing a single encrypted SD card and a satellite phone with its SIM still intact. Before Avery could bag the card as evidence, the east wall took RPG fire, chaos, people screaming, someone calling a casualty. Scout, trained in hostile retrieval protocol, trained to swallow small objects, rather than drop them in a firefight when capture was possible, had done exactly what 11 months of conditioning had taught him to do. He swallowed the card. Avery hadn't known. She wouldn't find out until much later. What she'd known immediately was that Scout had taken shrapnel from the blast. 3 pieces, one of them lodged near his right hip. She'd carried him out of the compound the same way she was carrying him now, face pressed into his fur, one hand over the wound to keep pressure while she ran. Colonel Brett Stinson had met her outside the aid station with the expression of a man who had already made up his mind. Stinson was the type of officer who spoke in logistics, assets, timelines, cost-benefit analysis. He'd looked at Scout the way a mechanic looks at an engine that's beyond repair. K9 Unit 77 has been assessed as non-mission capable, Stinson said. Permanent hip damage, partial hearing loss from concussive exposure. He's been reclassified as a liability asset. Euthanasia is scheduled for 600. You're shipping home Tuesday. Avery had argued. She'd cited the adoption regulations, the handler transfer protocols, every line of policy she'd memorized in 4 years of service. Stinson had listened with the patience of a man who had already written the ending. Unit 77 carries classified detection and retrieval training, he told her. Unpredictable behavioral profile post-injury. Can't be released into a civilian household. He paused. The dog is property, Nolan. Damaged property. That's all. That night, Avery didn't sleep. She thought about the look Scout had given her through the chain link of the veterinary holding pen, that amber-eyed, direct, completely trusting look that said, I know you're coming. I'm waiting. She went back at 0200. She cut the fence. She walked out carrying 72 pounds of classified government property under one arm and her entire military career in the other. She traded everything she had for a ride to the Turkish border and spent the next 3 weeks working her way home on cargo ships and bus lines, and the particular mercy of strangers who didn't ask questions. She had been running ever since. Now, standing on a crumbling Appalachian road, with the rain turning to ice and Scout's breathing going shallow against her collarbone, Avery was out of road. The nearest shelter was 11 miles back. She had $47 and a dog who was dying, and she could no longer pretend those two facts weren't connected. She stopped walking. "I know, boy," she said quietly, dropping into the low register she only used with him. "The one that meant I'm here. I've got you. Don't you worry." Scout turned his head slightly and pressed his nose against her jaw. It was a small gesture. It cost him something to make it. The headlights that appeared around the curve were the old kind, yellowish, mounted on a truck that had been built before Avery was born. It slowed to a crawl, then stopped completely. The window came down. "That is a standard-issue K9 tactical harness," said the woman behind the wheel, in a voice that had no business being that sharp and precise at what looked like 90 years old. "And you're carrying him in a 2-arm cradle with the weight distributed the way Lackland teaches for hip injuries. You're a handler." Avery said nothing. Her hand moved instinctively toward the fixed-blade knife on her belt. The woman looked at her without flinching. She had a face that was more architecture than softness. High bones, pale grey eyes, white hair pulled back under a dark wool hat. She wore a heavy canvas jacket with a fleece collar, and she held the steering wheel with both hands, but with the steadiness of someone who had never developed the habit of being afraid. "You don't have to tell me anything," the woman said. "But that dog is in respiratory distress. It's 31 degrees, and my farm is 4 minutes down this road. Whatever you're running from, it'll still be there in the morning. He might not." Avery looked down at Scout. His eyes were half closed. The breath from his nostrils was too shallow, too uneven. She made the only choice she had left. "Lead the way," Avery said. The farm at the end of the gravel road was not what she expected. A white clapboard farmhouse, 2 stories, with a wraparound porch, and a barn that had been kept in better repair than the house, lights on in the kitchen, smoke from the chimney, the smell of wood smoke, and something simmering on a stove. Inside, the house held the deep warmth of a place that had been heated by fire for 100 winters. "The woman, Agnes Whitaker," she said, without extending her hand, as if formalities were a luxury she'd long since stopped indulging, directed Avery to lay Scout on a wool blanket near the wood stove. The dog stretched out with a long, shuddering exhale, and some of the tension went out of his frame. Agnes moved through the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been feeding people in crisis for decades. Hot soup appeared, a bowl of plain cooked chicken cut small, coffee in a heavy mug that Avery barely trusted herself to hold. "Feed him first," Agnes said. "Small pieces. His stomach needs to wake up slowly." Avery sat on the floor next to Scout and fed him from her palm, piece by piece, watching the amber come back into his eyes as the warmth reached him. Only when he settled his head onto her knee, heavy and satisfied, did she touch the soup. Agnes sat across the room in a high-backed wooden chair, watching with those grey eyes that seemed to be filing everything they observed. "You didn't ask my name," Avery said. "I didn't need to ask for what I already know, Specialist Nolan." The spoon clattered against the bowl. The fire crackled. The farmhouse had the quality of silence that old places hold, full of weight, full of years. "How?" Avery said. Agnes set down her mug. "My late husband was General Raymond Whitaker. He spent 40 years in the Army, the last 12 as Inspector General of Special Operations Command. He knew every K9 unit handler roster in the active system. I've been reading those rosters since he died." She paused. "I know who you are. I know what you took. And I know whose dog you're protecting him from." Avery's jaw tightened. "Then you know I'm not going to apologize for it." I'm not asking for an apology, Agnes said. I'm asking you to listen. She rose from the chair with the careful, deliberate movement of someone whose body made everything cost something, crossed to the roll-top desk against the far wall, and returned with a manila envelope, thick and sealed. She set it on the table between them. Open it! The documents inside were a mix of military communications, surveillance records, and a sealed forensic report bearing a Department of Defense header. Most of it was redacted, but certain phrases remained visible, and Avery read them the way you read something that rearranges the world as you go. K9 Unit 77, mission log retrieval incomplete, object, encrypted SD-128, designation Night Ledger, status unrecovered. Subject, Colonel Brett Stinson, TS-SCI, internal inquiry suspended, see Note 7. General Whitaker, Raymond C., Internal Affairs referral, case pending tribunal, file closed, natural causes, 09 November. Avery looked up from the papers. Night Ledger, she said. Agnes nodded once. 2 years before your deployment, Agnes said, her voice going quiet and deliberate, Brett Stinson commanded a forward operations group in the Euphrates Valley. There was an incident, a building. He told his superiors it was a weapons depot. His own unit's helmet camera footage told a different story. Agnes's grip on her cane tightened until her knuckles went pale. 11 civilians. Stinson filed the reports himself, altered the coordinates, claimed the footage was corrupted. Avery's mouth had gone dry. A local journalist had spent 18 months documenting the cover-up. He compiled everything onto an encrypted SD card and stored it in a waterproof courier case in a safe house. When your unit hit that compound, you weren't standing in the middle of a weapons cache. Agnes met her eyes. You were standing in the middle of the only existing evidence that can put Brett Stinson in front of a war crimes tribunal for the rest of his life, and your dog found it. Avery thought about Scout, nose down, pawing at the false panel in the floor. She thought about the RPG hitting the wall. She thought about the trained response she'd drilled into him for 2 years. Retrieve, swallow, protect, do not release in hostile territory. He swallowed it during the evacuation, Avery said, and heard her own voice go flat as the realization fully arrived. He didn't pass it. The SD card was housed in a titanium protective sleeve, Agnes said. Waterproof, airtight, 4 millimeters thick. It cannot be digested. It is too large to pass naturally. She reached into the envelope and placed a glossy black and white film sheet on the table between them. It was a veterinary X-ray. In the center of the abdominal cavity, between loops of intestine, there was a rectangular shape, small, dense, unmistakable. It has been lodged in his upper intestinal tract for 11 months, Agnes said. You thought he was declining because of his hip, because of the cold and the months on the road. He has been declining because that object is creating an obstruction, a toxic one. It is slowly poisoning him from the inside. The room listed sideways. Avery looked at Scout on the wool blanket, his ribs too visible, his breathing too fast. 11 months of thinking she was saving him. 11 months of feeding him before herself, finding warmth when she could, keeping his wound clean with whatever she had. And all along, the thing she'd been running from was inside him, taking him apart from the inside. Stinson didn't want Scout euthanized because he was damaged, Avery said. No, Agnes said. He wanted the dog put down so he could recover the sleeve from the remains without anyone asking questions. When you walked off that base, Avery, you didn't just save Scout's life. You carried the only copy of the evidence that can end Stinson's career and his freedom, and you've been running with it for 11 months without knowing you had it. She paused. He hasn't been hunting you because you're a deserter. He's been hunting you because you are the only thing standing between him and everything he's spent 20 years protecting. Avery pressed her forehead against Scout's neck. The dog made a small sound and pushed his nose against her arm. We need a surgeon, she said. Her voice was steady. She had learned long ago how to be steady when everything was coming apart. "Already arranged," Agnes said. She reached up and pulled a cord hanging near the window. A moment later, the back door opened. A man in his late 60s walked through, wide-shouldered, deliberate, wearing surgical scrubs under a fleece jacket, carrying a heavy stainless steel case. He set it on the kitchen counter and looked at Avery with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who had spent a career operating under pressure. "Dr. Samuel Tuck," Agnes said. "Chief veterinary surgeon, Fort Bragg, 22 years. He owed Raymond more than he'll ever be able to repay. He has a sterile theater ready in the back barn." Dr. Tuck studied Scout for a moment, then looked at Avery. "Given his condition, anesthesia carries significant risk, but the blockage is going to kill him within 48 hours if we don't move. His organ panel is already showing stress." He paused. "Your call." Avery bent down and put her forehead against Scout's. He opened his eyes fully for the first time in days and looked at her with the absolute, unquestioning trust of an animal that has never doubted once. "Do it," she said. "Save him." They were carrying Scout toward the barn when every light in the farmhouse went out. Not a breaker trip, not a storm surge. The power line cut from outside, clean, instant, total. The kind of cut that took someone who knew what they were doing. 3 seconds of complete darkness. Then Agnes's backup generator hummed to life, and the barn lights returned, and the farmhouse stayed black. Dr. Tuck looked at Avery across Scout's body. She was already moving. "Lock that door behind you," she said. "Don't open it until I give you the all-clear, not for anything you hear." She came back through the dark farmhouse the way she'd been trained, moving on the sensory map she'd built of the space since they arrived, back flat against the wall, knife in her right hand, and Scout's steel training leash in her left. Agnes was in the main room, standing beside the dying fireplace. She was not hiding. She was not going to hide. She held a Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver, old, heavy, maintained to a mirror finish, in both hands, with the calm grip of someone who had been taught to shoot before most people learned to drive. "Get behind." "No," Agnes said quietly, and that was the end of that conversation. The sound came from the kitchen window. Not a break, a careful displacement of the latch, the kind learned in training programs that don't issue diplomas. Rubber soles on hardwood, moving slow and wide, no flashlight, thermal optics. He had every advantage in the dark. She needed to take that away. Above the fireplace, a heavy cast-iron trivet hung on a nail. Avery moved 2 steps, lifted it, and threw it hard into the far corner of the dining room. It hit the floor like a gunshot. The intruder reacted. He swept left, rifle up, optics scanning. Avery hit him from behind with Scout's steel leash, catching the night vision rig across the side of his head with everything she had. The optics shattered. The impact traveled up both her arms. He went sideways but didn't drop. He was big, fresh, trained, and he came back around with an elbow that caught her jaw and lit stars across her vision. She hit the floor hard. He was on her in a second, knee across her sternum, one hand going for her throat, the other pinning her knife arm to the ground. "Stinson sends his regards," he said. The revolver fired once from across the room. The man went rigid, then he toppled to the side. Agnes Whitaker lowered the Model 10 in both hands and looked at the man on her floor with the expression of someone who has been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. "Raymond sends his," she said. The intercom on the wall crackled, the old farmhouse system, wired in before Avery was born, and Dr. Tuck's voice came through, exhausted and steady. "Specialist Nolan, surgery is complete. We have the sleeve intact. He's in recovery. Heart rate is stabilizing." A pause, and then something that sounded almost like relief. "He's going to be fine." Avery sat on the floor of Agnes Whitaker's farmhouse and pressed both hands over her face and didn't make a sound for a long time. The encrypted sleeve went to the office of the Inspector General of the Department of Defense, through Agnes Whitaker's attorney in Washington, bypassing every level of the command chain that Stinson had spent 20 years building. It was accompanied by General Raymond Whitaker's private research files, 11 months of documentation collected between his discovery of Night Ledger and his death, and by a sworn statement from Dr. Samuel Tuck, who had performed an unauthorized surgical procedure on a classified military working dog and had no intention of pretending otherwise. Colonel Brett Stinson was arrested at his desk in Arlington on a Thursday morning. He did not resist. The court-martial proceedings opened the following week, with charges including falsification of military records, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and 11 counts of unlawful killing under the laws of armed conflict. The military prosecutors told the press only that new evidence had been recovered. They did not explain where it had spent the last 11 months or whose body had carried it home. Through Agnes Whitaker's contacts, and Agnes had more contacts than a woman living alone on a West Virginia farm had any reasonable right to have, Avery's case was reviewed by a 3-judge military board. Her desertion charge was reduced, then expunged entirely. Her honorable discharge was reinstated. 11 months of back pay landed in an account she'd nearly forgotten she had. The VA enrollment letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, and she stood in Agnes's kitchen and read it 3 times before she believed it. But those were just papers. The paper that mattered was the one she was holding 6 weeks later, standing in the barn doorway in the thin winter light that had finally broken through after the long gray fall. It bore the seal of the Department of the Army and was signed in 3 places, and it said, in the flat bureaucratic language that governments use for things they cannot quite quantify, that K9 Unit 77, male Belgian Malinois, designation Scout, was hereby transferred into the permanent civilian custody of one Avery Nolan, former Specialist United States Army, effective immediately and without condition. Scout was in the yard. He'd been out there for 20 minutes, working the fence line on 3 legs, and the carbon fiber brace Dr. Tuck had fitted 2 weeks prior. He wasn't running, but he was moving, investigating the east fence, with the focused, methodical attention of a dog who has decided the world is still worth examining, and every 30 seconds or so he glanced back at the barn door to confirm that Avery was still there. She was always there. Agnes came out of the house with 2 mugs and stood beside her in the doorway without saying anything for a moment. He found a rabbit hole along the east fence on his 2nd day out, Agnes said finally. He checks it every morning. I think he considers it a personal responsibility. Avery laughed, a real one from somewhere she'd forgotten she still had access to. We should think about getting out of your hair, she said. We've been here almost 2 months. Agnes was quiet. She watched Scout complete his circuit, nose down, deliberate, unhurried. Raymond always said land knows when it's being looked after, Agnes said. This farm hasn't been looked after since he died. The barn roof needs work come spring. The east field has gone to scrub. She glanced at Avery with those pale grey eyes. Dr. Tuck's been driving out twice a week for follow-up. He doesn't like to make the trip for nothing. Avery looked at her. Besides, Agnes said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it, nodding toward the yard. He's already claimed the rabbit hole. You can't relocate a working dog off an active assignment. Scout looked up from the fence line as if he'd heard his name. He held Avery's gaze with that steady, amber-eyed directness, the look that had never once asked for anything except to be trusted, to be beside her, to work. She had carried him 3 miles through ice and rain, on a road she didn't know, toward a destination she couldn't see, because she had decided that some things were worth everything you had. She'd been right. Yes, ma'am, Avery said quietly. I think you're right about that. Scout turned back to the fence. Avery set her mug on the porch railing and walked out into the pale winter light to join him.